we ignore the reality of what's going on for the last 70 years, that the Korea Peninsula was invaded by the United States empire.
I didn't ignore that at all.
Okay. And the point is in the moment that the nation of the North Korea is threatened, so they cannot be soft about human rights or social rights. Don't forget, in this country, on the beginning of the Hitler's war, we, this bright country, we round up all the Japanese, Italians, and Germans background, and we send them to concentration camp until the end of the war, thinking they're going to be spies or they're going to provide information.
Okay.
So please, the question is, can you provide another view, what really goes on, the real situation, as a judge, not as a professional who try to make a speech about human rights.
In a free country, you're entirely allowed to have your point of view, and I'm glad you got up and expressed it. And you remember that at the end of my talk, I pointed to the fact that North Korea itself has legitimate reasons for hatred of the United States, and this is because many of the things that were then later developed in Vietnam were used in North Korea. There was dreadful carpet bombing and many lives were lost, and there's a very good new book that has just been written by another judge, a former, he's still an active judge, Michael Pembroke, who's a judge of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. His father fought in Korea in the Australian force, and he went to Korea as a tourist, and he's written a very interesting book about Korea and explained why the people in North Korea feel very bitter towards the United States of America. If you want to read that, Michael Pembroke, Korea, What Began the American Century, I think it's the subtitle. But I didn't give a Western point of view at all. I simply told you of the people who came in large numbers before the Commission of Inquiry. And those people gave their testimony, and it's online, and what you've just said to me is what the Korean ambassador said to me. But my answer was, well, let me come in and have a look for myself, and then I can report. And if in fact what we've been told is not true, we will report what we see. No, we're not permitting you to come in. And then secondly, I said, have a look yourself at the testimony of the witnesses, because we didn't just keep it to ourselves, we put it online, and anybody in the world can see it, except in North Korea, where they don't permit people to have access to the internet. So I accept that in every case, I've been a judge for too long not to know that there's always another point of view. But in the case of North Korea, it's really a very grim situation, and I'm satisfied that the evidence we received was truthful evidence, overwhelmingly truthful evidence, and it has to be accounted for, it has to be answered, and that's why we produced our report, and that's why there's insistence even on the part of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. And that's why they have imposed very heavy sanctions. And that is why we have a problem on our hands, and we've got to face that problem. Next question.
First, thank you very much for being here, giving a fascinating talk. I'm only sorry that there aren't more people to hear it. As a judge, I'm just curious about how you differentiate between justice and legality, and whether you in fact provided, in your view, true justice to the testimony that you heard and you documented?
Well,
I'll just add something to that. In this forum, often the slogan is raised that peace without justice cannot ever be. And my view happens to be that peace with justice is simply just another war cry, but that's another topic.
well, this is a problem that a judge has to face all the time. I had a case in the High Court, it's a recorded case, about little children who were Hazara Afghans, and they came to our country seeking asylum with their parents. They didn't have visas, so in accordance with our Migration Act, they and their parents were locked up in detention camps just out of Adelaide in the middle of the desert. But a lot of good people in Adelaide said, let us have the children as foster parents. They will at least get education in the local public schools. They'll be able to play with children their own age, and therefore let us have the children. And the family court made an order that the children be released. And they did so by taking a very narrow interpretation of the provision of the Migration Act. The Migration Act says any person who arrives in Australia without a visa will be detained. And the argument was person means an adult person, because a child can't know how to get a visa, and therefore it only applies to an adult. And you can imagine that that was an argument that was attractive to me when I heard the case, because that would result in a kind of justice. You would have the children freed, but you'd say, well, the parents came without a visa, they're not going to be allowed to jump the queue, and they'll be just detained until we get round to their case. But there were two problems with that argument, and they were pointed out to the High Court during the case. Problem number one was that when the matter was being heard in Parliament, and it was not during a coalition government, it was during the Hawke government, and Jerry Hand was the Minister for Immigration. Officials from the Attorney General's Department came before Federal Parliament and said, if you enact this provision and it applies to children, then you will probably make Australia in breach of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This was specifically drawn by the officials who were doing their duty to the Federal Parliament. And the Minister said, I don't care, we're going to lock them all up. And secondly, there were provisions in the Migration Act which provided explicitly for how children in detention were to be searched. So that the Commonwealth argued, if the Act doesn't apply to children, why would Parliament have made provisions for the searching of children? So I then had to face the question, do I ignore what appears to be the correct interpretation of the law made by the Parliament of Australia? Do I show compassion and mercy and justice to the children? Or do I act as a judge and apply the law of this country? And I applied the law of this country, because the judges are servants of the law, and they can't just do what they think is right, because they may be wrong. Their duty is to give effect to the law made by the Parliament. And that's what I did. It wasn't a pleasant thing. What happened then was the children were taken by immigration officials. They were returned to the camp. Their parents gave up the fight. They left Australia, and when last seen, the children were on a bus to go through the Khyber Pass back into Afghanistan, and they've not been heard of since.
And some of their parents are dead.
That is not a terribly good outcome, and it's from the point of view of the children, it's not a just outcome. But I hope you understand that in this country the judges can't just sit there and do what they personally think is what they should do. Their duty is to apply the law, and that to apply it as gently and as kindly as they can, but not to ignore the law, because then you are putting yourself above Parliament, above the law, and you are not really pointing the finger at those who have to get the law right, which is the members that we elect to our federal parliament and state parliament. Okay, next.
Thank you, Michael. My question goes to the possibility of reunification of North and South Korea. Divided countries, of course, abhorrent, but there have been some successes historically. I think of Vietnam, Germany, obvious cases. But I'd like you to reflect a little bit more on what really are the obstacles to achieving it in this very different case, and in particular, how important is denuclearisation? I don't by that just mean denuclearisation of the North, but denuclearisation of the United States.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's a very good question, and it's interesting and it's very important to note that the people of Korea never agreed to the division of their country. This was something that was decided by F.D. Roosevelt, by Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill in Cairo in 1943. So there's a principle in international law, and it's actually in the international covenants, that says that in post-colonial circumstances, the people involved have to have a right to self-determination. And that right of self-determination, to finish the Japanese colonial period in Korea, because Japan had conquered Korea in 1911 and ruled it until the atomic explosions ended the war. They were never given a vote. They were never given a choice. It was simply the South was assigned to the United States and the North to the Soviet Union. And that is how it all began. And it hasn't been cured by a right of self-determination since. Interestingly, both regimes claimed to be the legitimate government of the whole peninsula. They never themselves accepted that they were the government of South Korea or they were the government of North Korea. So North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and South Korea is the Republic of Korea. And in the South, they have governors for the lost northern provinces, and I'm sure they have similar things in the North too. So whenever you would meet officials, when I met the former president of South Korea, President Park, who's now in prison because she was impeached and found guilty of offences, which says something about the legal regime and the judiciary in South Korea. But she would always emphasise, and all the ministers would emphasise, that they want a reunification. And that this is the dearest of their dreams. So at least we have this much, that both sides are insistent on the long-term objective. So it's a good thing that they agree. How can it be done? Well, you're correct to say that Austria, after the Second World War, did reunify. They were divided. A lot of people forget this, but Austria, Germany, and Korea were divided. And Germany reunited, but that wasn't by design. That happened when suddenly the Berlin Wall was pushed over, and suddenly the people were flooding out, and that led to the collapse of the German Democratic Republic, People's Republic, and that was very much connected with the personality of Mikhail Gorbachev, because he was not willing to put the tanks in. and that led to the end of the division of the Germanies. And it's very interesting when you drive there, into Germany, say into what was the DDR, you get to a point in the road, and the road is just a normal road, and you're just sailing along, and then there's a big sign on the side. This used to be the end of the Federal German Republic, and I've studied very closely what happened in the German case. It's true that there was, in the last years before the division, there was increase in the television programs, there were increases in the exchange of professors, more people were allowed to go out of the DDR, but there's nothing of that happens. What happens now is what you saw on the television. Very, very old people have to go into a ballot to try and get 15 minutes or an hour or so with their relatives, and they're all sobbing and crying. It's barbarous, it's terrible. So we're a long way from getting there. And there is this impediment. How do you deal with a regime which is terribly cruel to its own people? And how do you deal with the nuclear weapons, 20 of them, and with those missiles that terrified the Japanese? How do you deal with them at the same time as you're dealing with the issues of human rights of the people in North Korea? I was told by one witness in our inquiry, he said, my job was to pick up the bodies in the detention camp overnight, to put them into a wheelbarrow, to wheel the wheelbarrow to a vat which we had, to put the bodies in that and light the vat, fire the vat, and then the vat would reduce the bodies mainly to ashes, but the extremities, a leg or an arm, or would not be burnt, would not disintegrate. And then we would scatter the body pieces and the ashes on the nearby fields to give fertiliser to the fields where they had such food as they had for the prisoners. And that is what reminded me. I thought, I've come through 34 years as a judge in Australia, dealing with some pretty horrible things from time to time. I could never bear to look at the photos in appeals involving murder. It was enough for me to read about it. I didn't have to see the photos. But here I was sitting, hearing about things that were so similar to the concentration camps in Nazi Europe. So we've just got to get better in the way we deal with these problems, because otherwise there's hovering all over us. A person of my age is old enough to remember that mushroom cloud. Young people today don't know what you're talking about. They've lived under the mushroom, they've lived with thinking it never can happen, but it can happen. And we've got to try and make sure that it doesn't happen. Sorry for a long answer, but I agree there should be reunification. One day there will definitely be reunification, and it's just a question of how we get there.
Well, firstly, my apologies for being late and missing what everyone tells me was an excellent talk. I'd just like to read 2 short paragraphs by Noam Chomsky and then 2 very short questions following that. The true measure of the moral level of a society is how it treats the most vulnerable people. Few are as vulnerable as those who have fled to Australia in terror and who are locked away without charge, their terrible fate veiled in secrecy. We may not be able to do much beyond lamenting about North Korean prisons, but we can do a great deal about severe human rights violations right within reach. That's the end of the quote. What I'd like to know is, why don't judges, when they find that they're having to make a decision violating human rights or the rights of children, simply recuse themselves? Second question is, why don't more judges, people who are in a position to do so, speak out on human rights in this country and do something that would mean something? That's my 2 questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for asking those questions, and I understand what you're getting at. I tried to explain that a judge is quite often confronted with issues concerning human rights, and in my reasons, I never hesitated to be extremely critical where our law didn't give human rights. It cannot be consistent with the International Refugees Convention, where people are coming towards you to seek your asylum and protection, for us to outsource the handling of that matter to countries like Manus Island or in Papua New Guinea or Nauru or to Cambodia, of all places. So the role of a judge is to try to determine the case in accordance with the law, and it was always my view that in doing so you could take into account what international human rights law said. Most of my colleagues on the High Court of Australia didn't agree with that, and that led to disagreement, and that was why I was called the Great Dissenter. I don't much like that title because I think it's imposed on me by people who want to disempower the effectiveness of what I am determining. But you're not a completely free agent. And your question, why don't judges speak out about human rights? Well, if they want to become politicians and speak about human rights, they've really got to resign from the judiciary, and they've got to do that.
I mean, when they're retired or in some
Oh, when they're retired, oh well, they can go on and about it as long as they like.
They can even speak of politics in there.
Yes, exactly, and I never hesitated. And even when I was in judicial office, you'd have to choose your occasion. It would have to be a posh sort of a place, and all the members of the establishment would have to be there, and then you would explain why what we're doing is not consistent with universal human rights. And but in the actual judicial seat, you can't just ignore your obligations. You have to really put the finger where it belongs, which is on those who make the law, where the law does not conform to human rights. And, you know, we don't have in Australia a human rights charter in our constitution, and attempts to get that have constantly failed. Why that should be, I don't know. Maybe one day, maybe I'll live to see it. But I'm getting a bit long in the tooth now, so we better hurry up about that. Otherwise it won't be done. I hope it will be done. Most countries have a human rights charter. A lot of them ignore it, of course, but at least they have it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Chandran, and thank you for a great talk. My question relates to a glimmer of opportunity I feel that existed about 25 years ago when Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong something else, I don't exactly know, whatever, yeah. And he had a face-to-face meeting with the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, and they had an agreement by which he agreed to slow down or stop developing a certain type of missiles. And from what little I understand, he actually stuck to his side of the bargain, and when there was a change in government in America, I mean George Bush becoming the president, America simply said that agreement was not acceptable, similar to what they're saying about the Iranian thing now. So wasn't there a glimmer of opportunity that existed at that time, and shouldn't America also take some blame for not seizing that? That's my question.
Certainly, America should take a lot of blame. A blame for the carpet bombing, a blame for the way they fought the Korean War, the way they rushed up into China, and General MacArthur had to be sacked so that he wouldn't lead them into China. I mean, that really would have been a dangerous situation. And I have heard what you have just said. I don't know the details of it. It depends on who you speak to. If you're in South Korea and you speak to people there, they say that President Kim Dae-jung, who was the great civil libertarian who became the president in about 2000, they say he was duped by Kim Jong-il, who was the father of Kim Jong-un, and that he desperately wanted the Nobel Prize for Peace, which he got. He gave a huge amount of money, and he gave time, and that Kim Jong-il used that time to develop nuclear weapons, and that they were duped. Now, where the truth lies, I don't know. But here we are in a situation that he went ahead with developing nuclear weapons. He's allegedly got between 60 and 20, probably 20 nuclear weapons. The problem with the nuclear weapon is the problem that they faced in 1945. And you'll remember they called it the big one. It's a big bomb. And to put it on a rocket, it can't be too big. And so the question is, have they got the big one sufficiently small so that it can go on a nuclear, so that it can really threaten the neighbours and the United States? And we just don't know. I don't think anybody has enough knowledge of the strength of the nuclear arsenal. But it's not a good thing when a country with 24 million people, roughly the same population as Australia, but they've got the third largest standing army in the world. They've definitely got nuclear bombs because they've tested them, and they've definitely got very effective and brilliant missiles.
Okay, 3 more questions only, then we're going to wrap up.
First of all, thank you for the very informative and insightful talk. I was recently in South Korea, and comparing my trips back in 2003 to the demilitarized zone, there was a general feeling of less tension. And it leads to the question, is the media so powerful that it can actually mold public opinion in South Korea and say everything is going just right? And it's related to the second question. As ordinary citizens exposed to the media, and therefore subject to the court of public opinion, what must ordinary citizens like myself look out so that we instead support the court of law rather than the court of public opinion?
Well, you're quite right to raise the question about the attitudes in South Korea. Now, it's completely natural that in South Korea, where they've been living with this danger, I mean, forget about nuclear weapons, just ordinary old bombs and planes and rockets. South Korea is only about 100 kilometres from the border and from the weapons that are set up there, trained on Seoul. And therefore, it would be, just imagine if we lived in Sydney and then 100 kilometres away they had, forget there were nuclear weapons, they just had rockets and bombs and weapons trained on us 24/7. It would be a very frightening thing. So it is natural that people in South Korea would feel relieved that things are apparently getting a little bit better and that they're talking. And I think President Moon Jae-in is going to have another meeting with Chairman Kim Jong-un next week. So we'll all be watching to see where that goes. But the problem is, and I'll be quite blunt here, nobody is talking about the human rights of the people of North Korea. It's just gone off the agenda. It's gone off the radar. Nobody wants to mention it. It's like that thing with John Cleese. Don't mention the war. And nobody wants to mention it. And yet we get a little glimpse of it in that lottery of people, of very old people, who keep saying, my mother is 90 and I'm in my 70s, and unless we get these meetings and get an opportunity to meet people, we'll all be dead soon. And so some legislation was enacted in South Korea to discourage people talking about human rights in North Korea. And that was quite controversial because in South Korea, you know, there's a very active civil society. They effectively had huge demonstrations and drove President Park out of office. So they are very feisty in South Korea. I don't know if you know many South Korean people, but they are very, they are described as the Irish of Asia. They are feisty people, and they stand up for what they believe in, and they don't have too much ceremony about it either. I can say this in the Gaelic Club. So I think we've got to make progress on the security issue, because that is also a human rights issue. Unless we protect ourselves from nuclear weapons, then a lot of people will die. And that's why that's very urgent. But it's also urgent that we deal with the discrimination against women, the discrimination against people who have a different political view, and all the other terrible wrongs that are collected in our report.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the great talk. So the phrase that keeps going through my head is mind your own business, the North Korean expression. But I wonder if we are not unconsciously minding our own business in relation to Obama's promise to denuclearize, when in his term he increased the nuclear arsenal and therefore, I guess, posed more of a security threat. Yeah. So do we have to not mind our own business so much on the other side as well? And the second part of my question is about the law itself. Is it not anthropocentric? In that all we care about is if a human life is killed, or many human lives are killed, when in fact these hydrogen bombs are going off in the middle of the ocean and killing vast numbers, millions, billions perhaps of fish. This is our food supply, so it should matter as well. But it is so much concerned with human beings and the relative stakes according to how important that nation is, rather than the whole planet, the ecology and the food chain itself. Can we think about the law differently than that?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with your point about looking at both sides and trying to understand the perspective of each side. I'm not so sure that you're right about nuclear weapons being set off undersea, because I know there is a convention about that, and I met a man at a conference. He was a Canadian, Professor Strangeway, and he told of how there is an international agency that monitors every sound that comes undersea, and they are reporting on this and reporting on underground and undersea weapons. And the problem has not been undersea, that the underground weapons is where they test the weapons. Now, you are right that President Obama started, under the pressure of his generals, what was said to be a modernisation of the nuclear armaments of the United States. And Kim Jong-un might be interpreting denuclearization as including the American branch of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the Americans don't have nuclear weapons in South Korea. They did at one stage, but my understanding is they've withdrawn them, so they don't have them in the South. But Kim Jong-un might interpret the 4-point deal as meaning, we give up our nuclear weapons, you've got to give up your nuclear weapons. And whether or not that will happen, I think the world is now beginning to face up to this question. You may know about the BAN Treaty, and you may have heard of an organisation called ICAN, I-C-A-N. This was a citizens' movement that actually began in Melbourne, Australia, and they are working towards a United Nations treaty to ban the possession, use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The Americans hate it, and the nuclear powers don't agree with it. But there is a draft treaty and it's gathering signatures. Little New Zealand turned up, and little New Zealand has signed, though not yet ratified the treaty. The Americans try to discourage everybody who has had the protection of American nuclear arms. So it's not only President Trump who's talking about revamping the nuclear weapons. It began under President Obama. And so there is a bit of truth in what you say, that there's got to be both sides of denuclearization, and that is beginning in the BAN Treaty. But Australia didn't turn up, and as is so often the case, Australia just looks over its shoulder to see what our great and powerful friends are doing. But it may be that we should be taking our own stance, and we could learn a few things from New Zealand. You know, it's a small, beautiful and feisty little country that sometimes gives us a good clue as to what a brave country will do. And unless we do something under the BAN Treaty or something like it, there's always this terrible danger of accidents and mistakes. One last question.
I have seen North and South Korea form a pan-Korea sporting team. I have seen East and West Germany become one country, which I would never have believed possible after having drunk with members of both former Germanys in my time. And I've seen America elect a black president. I believe anything is possible. Now, there is just one little thing. I have heard there is a minefield running from coast to coast, 20 miles deep. Sorry to bring it up. It's so trivial.
This is in Korea.
Yes.
This is the demilitarized zone. Yes, it's the most heavily fortified part of the Earth's surface, and it's terribly dangerous. And I know from work I did earlier in Cambodia how terribly damaging and dangerous landmines are. And of course now there is a landmine treaty. They said we could never get a landmine treaty, but ordinary citizens worked towards the landmine treaty, and it was produced, it was ratified, and it is enforced, and it has led to United Nations efforts to remove the landmines. So that's what the ICAN said. They said, people say it can't be done, but it was done with the landmine, and we should be doing it with the nuclear weapons. Every young people with their mobile phones and living in their digital world don't think and talk enough about these issues. But unless we can get the nuclear weapon problem dealt with, it's even more important and urgent than climate change, because nuclear weapons, the whole business could be over in an afternoon, whereas climate change is a slowish sort of a process, and we've got to get that act together. But nuclear weapons is a desperately urgent thing, and it takes somebody who was old enough to remember the nuclear mushroom cloud in the papers, the media at the time, to try to remind the younger generation, you've got to pay attention to this. It's extremely dangerous. It's existential to our species, and we've all got to start taking it seriously. We've got to raise it with our politicians. I hope in the next federal election they'll be asked, what is Australia's position on the ban treaty? And what does your party believe should be done about the prohibition of the possession, use and threat of use of nuclear weapons? Because that is a desperately urgent problem for humanity.